The US is still far from a collapse, but it's not stable either.
Since perceptions on the economy can drive elections,
we learned that the economy, as you said,
for decades, Americans have felt like the system is stacked against them. Wages are stagnant, costs are rising, and wealth is concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. Many blame recent leaders, but the truth runs much deeper. Donald Trump, for example, is not the cause of today's economic crisis. He is a consequence of it, the result of nearly 50 years of growing inequality and eroding trust in institutions. So how did this happen, and how can we begin to fix it? To answer these questions, we need to cut through some of the biggest myths about the American economy. These myths have been repeated so often that they sound like common sense, but in reality, they blind us to how the system truly works and who it actually benefits. One of the most dangerous myths is that economics is a purely objective science, separate from politics and morality.
News from some new data that we've been able to put together that no one has ever seen before, and I'll just very quickly go through these.
That's simply not true. From its origins, economics was deeply tied to questions of power, fairness, and what kind of society we want to build. Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics, described himself not as an economist, but as a moral philosopher. He cared less about charts and equations, and more about what made a society just and livable. But over time, especially in the late 19th century, economics was stripped of this moral and political dimension. It was reframed as a science, supposedly neutral and above human values. Yet, in reality,
look, I think everything with the trade deal is on the table.
Economics is always shaped by decisions. Decisions about inequality, about who holds power, and about whose voices matter. Every rule of the economy, from the minimum wage to property rights, is a reflection of political choices. That leads us to another myth, the idea that markets are somehow natural and exist independently of government. In truth, there is no such thing as a market without rules. Think about it. Markets depend on laws that define what can be owned, what contracts can be enforced, how bankruptcies are handled, and what level of monopoly power is allowed. These rules don't fall from the sky. They are written by human beings, often under the influence of powerful interests. And here lies the problem. Over the past few decades, the rules of the game have been increasingly written by large corporations, Wall Street, and the wealthy elite. Lobbying and campaign contributions have given them outsized control over lawmakers. In fact, corporations and business groups now spend nearly 70 times more on lobbying than labor unions do. The result is a system where policies consistently favor the powerful at the expense of ordinary workers. This shift has dismantled many of the counterbalances that once gave working Americans a voice. In the 1950s, a third of private sector workers belonged to unions. Today, it's only about 6%. Small businesses have been squeezed out by giant retailers and online platforms. Local political parties, once tied to community needs, have become centralized fundraising machines, serving big donors. The outcome is clear: more wealth flowing upward, while ordinary families struggle to keep up. And yet, we're told another myth, that the richest people earned their wealth simply because they worked harder. But if that were true, wouldn't the hardest-working Americans, teachers, nurses, construction workers, farm laborers, also be among the wealthiest? Instead, what we see is that wealth largely follows power. CEOs and Wall Street executives often set their own pay, use stock buybacks to inflate earnings, and rely on insider knowledge to maximize profits. Many have monopolized industries, giving them the ability to charge higher prices while suppressing wages. Even more striking is how much wealth is simply inherited. Today, the single best predictor of your future income in America is the wealth of your parents. Around 60% of all wealth is inherited. We are now entering the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history, from wealthy baby boomers to their children, locking inequality even further into place. Meanwhile, wages for average workers have barely budged. Jobs are outsourced, unions are blocked, and new technologies replace workers without protections in place. The reality is that most Americans aren't struggling because they're lazy or unskilled. They're struggling because the rules have been rigged against them. This brings us to another lie, that corporate political spending is just free speech, In reality, it's legalized bribery. Back in 1971, a memo by future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell encouraged corporations to spend heavily on politics to protect their interests. Since then, corporate PAC spending has exploded. By 2016, big corporations and Wall Street were contributing $34 for every $1 contributed by labor unions and public interest groups combined. The richest 0.01% of Americans now supply a huge share of political donations, giving them disproportionate influence over both major parties. And what happens when money dominates politics? Laws get rewritten.
But looks like Donald Trump read the book wrong because he's confusing everyone.
Campaign finance restrictions are gutted. Antitrust enforcement is weakened. Bankruptcy laws are tilted to favor corporations while leaving ordinary families with no relief from student debt or foreclosure. Trade deals are crafted to protect corporate profits, even at the expense of jobs, communities, and the environment. Take globalization. We often hear that trade benefits everyone, but the truth is more complicated. Yes, American consumers get cheaper goods, but millions of manufacturing jobs disappeared between 2000 and 2017. Many lost to imports from China. And trade deals often prioritize intellectual property rights, financial interests, and corporate assets over workers' rights or environmental protections. That means profits are safeguarded while people and communities bear the costs. And then there's the myth that taxing the wealthy is socialism. In reality, the U.S. already runs a system of corporate welfare, funneling billions to large companies through subsidies, bailouts, and tax loopholes. Executives who mismanage companies often walk away with multi-million-dollar golden parachutes, while workers are left jobless. When corporations fail to pay living wages, taxpayers end up subsidizing their workers through programs like Medicaid and food stamps. In effect, ordinary Americans are paying the bill to keep corporate profits high. The truth is that jobs are not created by tax breaks for billionaires. Jobs are created when working and middle-class people have money to spend. Henry Ford famously doubled wages so his employees could afford to buy the cars they built, fueling demand and growth. When ordinary Americans have more purchasing power, businesses grow. When they don't, the economy stalls, as it did during the Great Depression, when inequality reached dangerous levels. Another common myth is that inflation is caused mainly by wage increases or government spending. But today's inflation is often driven by corporate concentration. With fewer competitors, major companies in industries like food, airlines, and pharmaceuticals can raise prices at will. Just 4 corporations control most of the meat industry. 3 giant chains dominate groceries in many cities. Airline mergers have reduced choice, while drug companies keep prices high by buying up rivals. Instead of breaking up monopolies, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, a blunt tool that slows the economy, suppresses wages, and hurts working people most. Real inflation control would mean restoring competition and using antitrust laws to prevent corporations from artificially hiking prices. Then there's the belief that endless economic growth is always good. But unchecked growth has enormous costs, especially for the climate. Extreme weather events, wildfires, pollution, and rising seas all impose devastating economic and human burdens. Economists call these externalities as if they were side effects. But for families who lose homes in a wildfire or communities poisoned by industrial runoff, these aren't external at all. They're life or death. If we accept that Earth's resources are finite, then infinite growth is not sustainable. Just as we limit overfishing or logging, we must limit carbon emissions, plastic production, and land exploitation. A healthy economy cannot come at the cost of a dying planet. And finally, one of the most corrosive myths, that those drawn to leaders like Trump are simply ignorant. The truth is more complicated. People turn to strongman figures when they feel abandoned and powerless. For many working Americans, the dream of upward mobility has collapsed. They work longer hours for lower pay, often without health care or security. Life expectancy for Americans without a college degree has actually been declining, a shocking reversal driven by stress, poor access to health care, opioids, and gun violence. When inequality grows this extreme, democracy itself is at risk. People lose faith that the system can deliver fairness, and demagogues exploit that anger to fuel division and hate. By 2016, the richest 0.1% of Americans owned as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. That is not a recipe for stability or democracy. But here's the hopeful part. None of this is inevitable. These are not forces of nature, but human-made rules that can be rewritten. We have the power to shape an economy that works for the many, not just the few. It starts with exposing the myths, recognizing the role of power in economics, and demanding rules that put people above profits. You've stayed with us through this journey, and that means you care about the future of our economy and our democracy. So here's the question. Do you think America can rebuild a fairer system, one where ordinary people have real power again? Or has inequality already gone too far? If you found this video eye-opening, please give it a like. It really helps more people discover these truths. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. And share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. Together we can challenge the myths, spread the facts, and take the first steps toward an economy that truly works for everyone.